Hello, hopefully you're watching this video because you need to learn how to do an introduction for your To Kill a Mockingbird paper. So, you should all already have your thesis statement. You see here I've got my thesis, which is To Kill a Mockingbird can be considered a literary classic because it delves deeply into meaningful themes, it is still relevant in society today, and it makes readers think about their own place in the world. So your intro needs to get you from the beginning of your whole essay to this thesis statement. So you need to have some sort of hook that hooks the reader's interest, and then you have to introduce both the book and the idea of a classic somehow. So we've talked about hooks before and what kind of hooks are usually good. I came up with a variety of ways that you can hook in this situation. Like, you're not always going to be able to ask a question. You're not always going to be able to start with a relevant quote. And sometimes you have to alter some of those things depending on what the topic of your essay is. So in this particular situation, where you're writing a literary analysis of a book, I would say a couple good things you can do to hook your readers are, number one, maybe use a book quote from To Kill a Mockingbird. This does not count as one of your necessary book quotes. You still need to have all of those in your body paragraphs. But if you want to start with something, that can be a good way to begin, usually. You could describe a specific part of To Kill a Mockingbird in detail, and then segue into the idea of a classic. You can mention a list of famous classics and then sort of discuss what they might have in common. Or you can deviate from that. I mean, anything you want that's going to be interesting. The more creative you are, the better. But you just have to make sure you're trying to interest your reader and lead smoothly to your thesis. So, for example, and I only have these examples in this video, so if you need to pause it and take a sec to look them over, that might be necessary. But for one, if I wanted to think about a book quote to use, I thought, well, for example, what's one part that people would know? People who have read To Kill a Mockingbird would instantly recognize. So I decided to start this intro paragraph. Quote, "In the name of God, do your duty," end quote, pleads Atticus Finch, his last words to a jury who hold the fate of an innocent man in their hands. And since it's such a well-known quote, or such a well-known scene, you don't really have to cite it in this situation. And then you move on. This scene from To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is ingrained in the memories of countless readers throughout the decades. But this book is more than just memorable. It's well known as a literary classic. To Kill a Mockingbird can be considered a literary classic because blah, blah, blah. So I introduce the book. I talk about how this quote is memorable, but the book is not just memorable, it's also a classic. And then the book is a classic because blah, blah, blah. So this flows fairly nicely. If we want to use the second kind of thing I think will work, describing a scene in detail. And there's a lot you could talk about. You could talk about, you know, the image of Scout and Jim running down the street. You could talk about the trial scene. Everybody knows the trial scene. You could talk about a variety of things. But one part that made me laugh was when she gets stuck in the ham. So I could start. Scout Finch, trapped in her handmade wire costume, scrambling away from the clutches of a man deathly intent on getting revenge for the loss of his reputation. Boo Radley, a crazed recluse, finally coming out of his house for the first time in years, only to save the life of his young friend. Scout and Boo are two of the most well-known literary characters in history, but do well-known characters automatically make a classic? In actuality, To Kill a Mockingbird can be considered a classic because it delves deeply into this blah, 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 blah. So in this case, you'll note my sentences here, these are not complete sentences, the one about Scout and the one about Boo, they're fragments, and that's a stylistic choice that I made. But I talked about, you know, this particular scene and saying, oh, well, these characters are really famous. Does that make this book a classic? No, really, it's these things. So in this case, to make my thesis flow, I actually had to add a little bit to the beginning of it, add a little transition, which might be necessary for yours. But that's one thing you can think about doing. But no, I tried to be as specific as possible with my word choice. I didn't say she's, you know, running away, or I didn't say, like, Scout Finch getting attacked by Bob Ewell. I tried to put that she's trapped in this handmade wire costume. She's scrambling away from his clutches. because he is deathly intent. He's not just intent on getting revenge, he is going to kill to get revenge, etc. So you want to be as descriptive as possible. And then my last kind of thing I came up with, just talking, instead of going with the To Kill a Mockingbird intro, way you could talk about classics at the beginning. And you could do this a number of ways, but one thing I thought of would just be like talking about classics in general. So my fake intro is The Great Gatsby, Fahrenheit 451, Pride and Prejudice. These books are all literary classics, but what do they all have in common? What exactly qualifies a book as a classic? Harper Lee's famous 1960 novel To Kill a Mockingbird seems, at first glance, drastically different than these more literary novels. However, To Kill a Mockingbird can still be considered a classic because it does these things. So in this case, I introduced the idea of a classic before I start talking about the book specifically. But any of these, they're more, I think these are fairly interesting. This one is probably my favorite, this one or this one. The last one is kind of like, meh. Because I would, as a reader, I would then be like, I don't care what they have in common. But it's still better than saying, you know, whatever else you might say. So maybe give one of these things a shot. If you want to try it a different way, that's fine. But remember, you just need to try to make it slightly interesting and also lead into your thesis. You may have to change the way you introduce your thesis in order to make it flow better. But give it a shot.